It's the end of the day, and you reach for something. Maybe it's the kettle. Maybe it's the bottle on the shelf above the fridge. Maybe it's the gummy in the drawer, sitting next to 3 takeaway menus and a charging cable for a device you no longer own. You're drinking out of a mug that says rise and grind, a joke you stopped finding funny several years ago. And at some point tonight, you'll probably type a question into a search bar about whether 2 of those things are fine together, read roughly 3 sentences of the answer, and decide that they are. Nobody sees you do it. That's the strange part. Not the shelf. The shelf is ancient. Almost every item on it would be recognized by someone who died 3,000 years ago, and they'd recognize the reason too. The part that would stop them cold, the part that would look genuinely broken to them, is that you're doing it alone, on a Tuesday, for no stated reason, with nobody keeping time. For almost all of human history, that combination did not exist. We tell this story wrong. Ancient drug use gets served up as a list of weird plants. Look what they smoked, look what they drank, wasn't that wild? But the plants are the boring half. What your ancestors actually built, the thing that took generations of effort and got carved into stone and passed down through people who could not read or write, was the room around the plant. Who's allowed? When? How much? Who watches you? What happens to you afterwards? That was the technology. The mushroom was just a mushroom. And here's my honest take. Before any of the evidence, we kept the substances and threw away the room, and then we acted surprised when it went badly. The World Health Organization counted around 2.6 million deaths linked to alcohol in 2019 alone. Your ancestors were not better chemists than us. They were better architects. So let's look at what they actually built. Start with the oldest drink anyone can prove. In 2018, Li Liu and her team at Stanford published an analysis of stone mortars from Raqefet Cave on Mount Carmel in Israel. They found starch residue from wheat and barley, altered in the exact way grain is altered when you malt it, mash it, and let it ferment. A thin, porridge-like beer, roughly 13,000 years old. That date is doing something violent to the timeline. These were Natufians, hunter-gatherers who had not invented farming yet. No fields, no villages, no writing, no pottery. And they were brewing. Now, the detail that matters more than the date. Raqefet Cave was not a kitchen. It was a graveyard. The Natufians buried their dead there, sometimes on beds of flowering plants, and the brewing stones sat right among the graves. The oldest beer we can point to wasn't somebody's Friday night. It was made at a funeral, in a specific place, for a specific occasion, by people who had walked there to bury someone. The same thing turns up again in China. At Jiahu in Henan province, Patrick McGovern and his colleagues found residue in pottery from around 7000 BC, a fermented mix of rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and grape. 9,000 years old, and about 4,000 years older than the first writing. That's remarkable on its own. But Jiahu also gave us something else. Bone flutes, cut from the wing bones of red-crowned cranes, and some of them still play. So the oldest drink we know of comes with a soundtrack and a burial. Notice what's missing from both of those sites. Nobody is drinking alone. Nobody is drinking because it's Tuesday. If the substance was always tied to an occasion, then somebody had to be in charge of it. So who was? Here's where it gets interesting. In 2023, a team led by Elisa Guerra-Doce at the University of Valladolid published a study in Scientific Reports on a cave called Escarich on the island of Menorca in Spain. Inside a sealed chamber, someone had left small tubes carved from antler and wood, decorated with concentric circles. Inside the tubes, human hair, dyed red. They ran the hair through a mass spectrometer. It came back carrying 3 alkaloids, ephedrine, atropine, and scopolamine. That's a stimulant from a shrubby plant called joint pine, plus 2 compounds from the nightshade family, mandrake, henbane, thornapple. These are not gentle. Scopolamine at the wrong dose produces delirium, memory loss, and the sensation of leaving your own body. Atropine dilates your pupils until light hurts, dries your mouth to paper, and races your heart. A modern anesthetist handles these with a chart and a monitor. And here's the thing about hair. Hair grows at a known rate, so it keeps a record. The Menorca sample didn't show one wild night. It showed repeated use across roughly a year. Somebody was doing this as a job. That's a completely different picture from the one most of us carry. Not a wild-eyed figure eating whatever the forest offered. A trained specialist, taking measured doses of powerful anticholinergics over a year, at around 1000 BC, in a community that was feeding that person, waiting for that person, and depending on whatever they came back with. And when it was over, the hair was cut, dyed, sealed in a carved tube, and hidden in a cave chamber. You don't do that with a hobby. You do that with an archive. And there's one detail in that study I can't stop thinking about. The chamber was sealed around 800 BC, at a point when life on the island was changing fast, and the old traditions were being pushed aside. The researchers read the sealing as a deliberate move to protect these objects while the culture around them shifted. Somebody made a call. If the practice was ending, the record of it was going to be hidden rather than lost. That isn't superstition. That's archiving under pressure. The same instinct as a librarian hauling boxes out of a building that's already smoking. The specialist pattern shows up everywhere once you know to look for it. At Zhezhenkal Cemetery, high in the Pamir Mountains of western China, Yimin Yang and Robert Spengler published a study in Science Advances in 2019 on wooden braziers found in graves from around 500 BC. The residue showed cannabis with unusually high levels of the psychoactive compound, noticeably stronger than the wild plants growing nearby, which suggests these people had gone looking for the potent stuff on purpose. And in the same cemetery, archaeologists found an angular harp. So let's reconstruct that afternoon. You're standing at 9,000 feet, with wind coming off the ice. There's a body in the ground. The braziers get lit, and the smoke pools low in a small stone chamber, and it stings, and somebody starts playing. Nobody there is doing this for a good time. They're doing it because they believe the dead person can still hear, and the smoke is how you get a message through. Across the world, in the Shumla caves along the Rio Grande in Texas, Martin Terry and colleagues radiocarbon-dated peyote buttons in 2006, around 5,700 years old, and when they tested them, the mescaline was still in there. Those buttons had been prepared and kept, trimmed, dried, stored, not grabbed and eaten, curated. Different continents, different plants, no contact between them, same shape of answer. So why does the shape keep repeating? Let that sit for a second, because the pattern is almost uncomfortable. Groups of people who never met, who shared no language and no trade route, all worked out that certain plants opened a door, and then all decided, independently, that the door needed a doorman. Peyote in North America, restricted to ceremony. Cannabis in the Pamirs, restricted to burial. Nightshade in Menorca, restricted to one trained person. The most famous version happened in plain sight, for nearly 2,000 years. Every autumn, thousands of Greeks walked from Athens to the town of Eleusis, for a ritual that ended with drinking something called the kykeon. Initiates described the same things across centuries, the self-dissolving, contact with the dead, a reality that felt more solid than daily life. Talking about what happened inside carried a death sentence. Cicero, who was initiated himself, wrote that Athens had given the world nothing better. In 1978, Gordon Wasson, Albert Hofmann, and Karl Ruck argued that the kykeon was psychoactive, most likely through ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and contains the chemical starting point Hofmann had used to make LSD. Support later came from a drinking vessel at Mas Castellar de Pontos in Girona, where Jordi Juan Traseras reported ergot alkaloids in the residue. I want to be careful here, because this is where a lot of videos overreach. That is a hypothesis, not a settled fact. 1 cup in Spain is not a chemical confession from an entire Greek institution. What we can say is narrower and still strange. The ritual at the center of Greek religious life involved a drink, a controlled setting, a fixed date, a trained priesthood, and thousands of people describing near-identical experiences afterwards. Which brings us to the question underneath all of this. Why is the pattern so universal in the first place? The most useful answer I've found comes from Ronald Siegel, a psychopharmacologist at UCLA, who spent his career on it and laid it out in his 1989 book Intoxication. Siegel argued that the pursuit of intoxication is a fourth drive, sitting alongside hunger, thirst, and sex. Not a vice, not a modern failure, a drive. His evidence wasn't only human. Animals do this constantly. In 2009, Tasmania's Attorney General Lara Giddings told Parliament that wallabies were breaking into the state's licensed opium poppy fields, eating the crop and moving in circles, which is, to my knowledge, the only recorded case of an animal being formally reported to a government for being high. Siberian reindeer and fly agaric mushrooms show up again and again in the ethnographic record. Elephants go out of their way for fermented fruit. If Siegel is right, then nothing your ancestors did was unnatural. The urge was already there, running in the hardware, older than our species. What humans added wasn't the appetite, it was the rules. And there's one more idea I have to mention, because it refuses to die. In 1992, Terence McKenna published Food of the Gods and argued that psilocybin mushrooms growing in the dung of grazing animals on the African grasslands drove the expansion of the human brain. The stoned ape hypothesis. Most evolutionary biologists don't accept it. And the main objection is simple. You can't inherit a drug experience. That's not how genes work. But it hasn't gone away. And the reason is that one piece of it turned out to be real. In 2018, Calvin Lai and David Olson at UC Davis published work in Cell Reports classifying psilocybin as a psychoplastogen, a compound that measurably grows new connections between brain cells. The mycologist Paul Stamets has said publicly that he finds the broad idea worth taking seriously. Is the stoned ape hypothesis true? Almost certainly not in the form McKenna wrote it. Is the underlying question stupid? No. And it's still the funniest possible origin story for a species that later built cathedrals and the internet. Now the twist, and it's the whole point of this video. We usually picture history as a slow climb toward freedom, with ancient people trapped under superstition and us finally allowed to do what we like. Run the evidence again, and it inverts. Casual, private, solo, recreational use. The thing you probably think of as normal is the recent experiment. It's the anomaly. The historical baseline is the opposite. Rare, scheduled, supervised, expensive, frightening, and shared. We didn't get freer, we got unsupervised. Which brings me to two people. The first is that specialist on Menorca, around 1000 BC. Their hair records roughly a year of controlled dosing. They took scopolamine inside a room full of people who knew what was happening, on a date the community had agreed on, with someone else keeping time and someone else deciding when it was over. Afterwards, the community kept the hair. It was cut, dyed red, sealed in a carved tube, and placed in a chamber that was then sealed shut. The experience belonged to everybody. The second is somebody tonight. Same species, same brain, roughly the same chemistry, sometimes literally the same plant families. Alone, at 2 in the morning, with a phone. Everything changed except the molecule. One of those two people had a container, the other one has a shelf. So when did humans start doing this? The honest answer is that we don't know, and we probably never will. Almost nothing survives. Plants rot, smoke disappears, and the only reason we have any of this is a handful of accidents. Hair sealed in a tube, starch trapped in stone, residue baked onto pottery. Every date in this video is a floor, not a ceiling. Push a spade into the right cave next year, and all of it moves further back. What we can say is this. Somewhere on Mount Carmel, 13,000 years ago, a Natufian scraped fermented grain out of a stone hollow at the edge of a grave, felt it land, and understood that the world had gone soft at the corners. That person was not alone. That was the point. It's the end of the day, and you reach for something. 13,000 years later, you're lifting the same cup. The only thing you're missing is the room. So here's what I actually want to know, and I want a specific answer, not a general one. What's the one thing left in your life that still has a container? Something you only do with other people, in a certain place, at a certain time, with rules you didn't invent. Put it in the comments. I'll read them. And if this made you look at your kitchen shelf slightly differently, that's the video working.